Details are slowly leaking out about the forensic audit of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations in Saskatchewan. The political advocacy organization that represents more than 70 First Nations in that province has refused to comment so far. Indigenous Services Canada says it presented the findings of the audit to the FSIN on September 11th, and a summary will be available for the public before September 30th. For more on this, we're joined by our Truth and Politics panel. Jennifer Laewetz is the CEO of Paskwâw Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Jennifer, Niigaan, been some time. Great to see you both. Jennifer, we'll start with you. A report saying as much as $34 million in spending has been categorized by the audit of FSIN as being ineligible, questionable, or unsupported. What can you tell us about this?
There's been, screenshots and some information floating around on social media over the last week, especially since the audit was apparently completed. We don't have the final report yet. I don't know anybody that's been able to even read it that can pass on some information on what's going on. But what I do know is that it seems like we're not getting a lot of communication. Chief Kelly Wolf from Muskeg Lake had put out there was a news article the other day saying the FSIN just hasn't been talking to anybody. And I think that's one of the biggest problems we're seeing right now is what is going on? Why is this organization that represents over 70 First Nations and tons and tons and tons of First Nations people in Saskatchewan saying nothing? So there's not a lot of information to give right now because the FSIN is not communicating or giving any of that information to the public.
Niigaan, Indigenous Services Canada has told APTN that the department provided an estimated $141 million to the FSIN for the period that's under review. So this is almost 1/4 of that spending needing accounting for. Is that a pretty big deal?
Well, let's break it down a bit. The expenses that were indicated as concerning, there was about $30 million of spending that was deemed as quote unquote unquestionable. And then there was about $150,000 that's unsupported, and then $3.7 million that's completely ineligible. In any place, anywhere, if there were millions of dollars that were deemed ineligible for use, let's just take that very small fraction amount right there. We're talking almost $4 million of ineligible spending that for things like looks like auto use, uses for maybe perhaps supporting dinners or meetings of some kind. My point of it is it just leads to a whole lot of questions and a whole lot of questions that may not be answered. One of the real problems for anyone who works in this, such as we do, is that it's very difficult to trace the money lines. Much work within First Nations governance is lacking human resources, and then on top of that, people who perhaps are coming from communities or situations in which there hasn't been a lot of administrative either support or engagement or thought put into the administration of these meetings. And then on top of that, then there's the issue of corruption, which seems to be at least somewhere in some of this. And so there's a lot of questions that come out of this that I think that the federal government, who is supposed to be overseeing this, needs to answer.
Jennifer, the largest item here is more than $20 million in COVID funding. Some chiefs have been calling for transparency from the leadership who have been silent, as we said. When the details are finally made public, what do you expect the fallout to be?
It's hard to say what the fallout will be because when it comes to situations like this, it goes beyond just what's right and wrong. And there's, very close family ties, there's very close community ties in us as a people. And so naturally, there's going to be those kind of balancing of how do we approach something like this. There will be chiefs that inevitably will support the FSIN no matter what. There are chiefs that, are going down the road of this is not right. Our communities were suffering, especially during COVID, which was a time of a crisis. And those dollars were supposed to be used for protecting our people. And to hear that some of that money may have been misused. And we've been hearing COVID funds over and over and over again. And I think it's because it was such a large pool of funding handed out so quickly to get us the help that we needed during a time of, again, crisis, that I feel like the federal government is kind of what kind of safeguards did we put in place? What kind of safeguards did they have in place? And now who's responsible for that? And how is the government even going to claw that back if it isn't spent properly? So I think that's going to be the question over the next coming weeks when we start to hear more about this audit and the report is released.
Niigaan, we asked Indigenous Services Canada if they would be forwarding the audit to the RCMP. The department ignored that question, but what do you see as possible outcomes here?
Oh, they for sure would ignore that because they're culpable in the lack of oversight. There is some kind of passing the buck here, as Jen, I think, alluded to in our last answer, in that there is a real lack of oversight here when it comes to First Nations. But I also have a great deal of empathy because a lot of First Nations, and particularly Indigenous organizations and lobby groups that lead, like the FSIN, it is in a situation in which they'll claim sovereignty. They claim that they don't have any duty to provide distinct accountability on certain funding and programs in which they're administering because it's an issue of control. Here's the problem. My empathy goes so far as to our chiefs acting honorably, responsibly, and ethically, even though they are chronically under-resourced, put into very difficult situations, a lack of human resource in our communities in particular, and high demands, emergency situations. So I have a lot of empathy for that, but you aren't helping the argument when you are leaving it up to organizations, accounting firms, governance to be able to hold you to account. We should have people and leaders that are willing to step up and provide the accountability and the distinctive paper trail, as it were, to where that money was spent, and that just seems to not be here. It seems to be very absent.
We'll leave it there. We're going to talk about some exclusive reporting by APTN News on what was happening behind the scenes at Indigenous Services when changes were made to Jordan's principal. Jennifer, internal Indigenous Services Canada emails reveal internal confusion and inconsistent decisions after Ottawa restricted Jordan's principal services amid skyrocketing costs. We've been seeing some of that play out. What are your thoughts about what was happening behind the scenes?
Well, we had heard, that there were a lot of areas that Jordan's principal was being used for that maybe shouldn't have been used for, modeling headshots and things like that. So I think that the government just enacted really quickly some type of policy, and that was to put a pause on so many of these applications. But I think that confusion is also what we're feeling on the ground of what is covered, what's not. And is this just, a quick, how do we just stop this from ballooning to the point it has? Because we've seen Jordan's principal funding has increased and increased and increased, and the budget's ballooned. And I think, internally, ISC was kind of just like, oh my God, stop everything that you're doing right now. But when you don't have proper eligibility criteria and people don't know what it is that they're supposed to be approving, I think, people on nations or people that are responsible for approving these applications were confused. People internally were confused. And I think even right now, a lot of us are confused because Jordan's principal is still up in the air. And I worry about what that looks like for the people that need those immediate services.
Niigaan, costs were ballooning, according to government documents, from $1.07 billion in 2020-21 to $1.7 billion in 2022-23. Indigenous Services has spoken out about possible misuse for things like modeling headshots. Many families online allege there's been misuse while they struggle to get help. Do we know what went on?
Well, I've seen everything. Being a member of the media, you're slipped documents all the time, and I've seen everything from hockey equipment to renovations on houses to so-called experts in certain areas that can help children. I mean, let's get back to what is the purpose of Jordan's principal funding? It's for on-reserve children, but also Indigenous First Nations children that are in areas in which there's lack of supports, lack of resources, to have the same opportunities as all other Canadians. Like, where does that begin and where does that end? The fact that it was so vague to begin with tells you that the federal government doesn't have that answer, but it also tells you that those who are involved with asserting Jordan's principle might have opened the gates too much and led to their own demise. When we don't define that as a people, as First Nations people, to say this is what the criteria of Jordan's Principle should be, we were the ones, leadership, First Nations leadership in particular, should have been the ones to say Jordan's Principle funding should be used for these criteria. And the fact that there is such a openness or a vagueness, do we want the federal government to be able to tighten those restrictions? No, obviously not. And it's a real lack of, I think, oversight and vision when it comes to the Jordan's Principle program, because what it was then used for is, frankly, a lot of people in powerful positions who have access to those applications and decisions around those applications, using things for hockey equipment. Do I think that First Nations kids should have an opportunity that all other kids have in cities? Absolutely. That may or may not involve certain elements that we might deem frivolous right now, but we need to come up with criteria, First Nation-centered criteria, devised by our leadership to decide what it is that fulfills the criteria of Jordan's Principle.
Jennifer, after that February 10th bulletin earlier this year, there were new rules in place. The reporting says internal concerns were piling up at Indigenous Services. What do you think the impact for users of those services has been?
Well, when you put a pause to anything or you scale it back because you've created so much bureaucracy, and we are partially to blame for that. I wouldn't say, it's always been intentional, because when communities are underfunded and we're not given the proper resources, there are going to be certain funding streams that almost come in and are used to top up some of those areas. Even COVID funding might have been one of those things, like we talked about earlier. But at the same time, the implication, I think, on ISC has meant that there are people being left out from getting those immediate supports that they might need. Mental health supports, health supports. I'm just concerned at what that looks like for those very, very urgent cases that are getting lost in the pool of everything else that might not be as important.
Niigaan, what do you see as the future of Jordan's Principle?
Well, generally nailed it on the head there by going, the problem here is that children are being impacted. They are suffering and dying because what's happened is that a program that was intended to deal with that issue was overcome, with, I think, the needs of our communities, but also some misuse of that funds because of the vagueness around the definitions of what constitutes Jordan's Principle monies. And that is a real lack of oversight that isn't just from the federal government, but also lands at the feet of leadership. What is going to happen? I think we may be seeing a severe restriction put onto Jordan's Principle that will be externally imposed. It will not make people happy, and it will be at the grounds of a bureaucrat, maybe in Ottawa, maybe a bureaucrat working with the First Nation, but certainly an external force from our communities who will then hold a very stringent kind of restriction. This is the box. This is what Jordan's Principles funds are to be used for. And then we're going to be forced to face a criteria that we did not create and try to fit into that. And I hope that there's a learning lesson out of this, and it is that we have to step up first. We have to come up with our own criteria, and then we have to hold to it as a standard, good, bad, great, ugly, and then learn along the way of whether we want to open that up, whether we want to close it off, and we have to take control over that issue.
And for more on what was going on behind the scenes at Indigenous Services with Jordan's Principle, you can visit our website, aptnnews.ca, to see Karen's story. Jennifer, Niigaan, we'll leave it there. Great to see you both.
Thanks.